The CDC institutes a new eviction moratorium despite the ruling of the courts. We'll solve the COVID long question of if the moratorium really helps anyone, and a refreshingly patriotic U.S. Olympian makes conservative headlines. This is Newsworthy. As you may know, on Tuesday, the CDC instituted a new eviction moratorium in place of the moratorium that expired on July 31st. The old moratorium basically denied landlords the right to evict tenants, regardless of if they were paying rent or not. So, under the moratorium, tenants were legally allowed to stay rent free without the landlord having any say in the matter. Before we dig into this topic, I just have one question. Who gave the CDC this authority? Really, this is a serious question that I have. Who gave the CDC this authority? The answer is clearly no one. There is no legal basis, and they do not have the authority to create an eviction moratorium. In fact, when this went to the courts, Justice Kavanaugh said in June that the CDC had, quote, exceeded its existing statutory authority by issuing a nationwide eviction moratorium, unquote. Kavanaugh warned that the moratorium could not be renewed without, quote, clear and specific congressional authorization. Instead of abiding by what Kavanaugh and the court ruled, the CDC created a new moratorium that affects areas experiencing, quote, substantial and high levels of community transmission. This still affects 80% of the counties across the US. So, at this point, you may be asking yourself, what does an eviction moratorium even have to do with COVID? Well, the CDC put out a statement on August 3rd detailing their reasoning. So let's go through it and see just how well this holds up against scrutiny. So, from the statement that they gave on August 3rd, quote, the eviction moratorium allows additional time for rent relief to reach renters and to further increase vaccination rates. In the context of a pandemic, eviction moratoria, like quarantine, isolation, and social distancing, can be an effective public health measure utilized to prevent the spread of communicable disease. Eviction moratoria facilitates self isolation and self quarantine by people who become ill or who are at risk of transmitting COVID 19 by keeping people out of congregate settings and in their own homes. So, from this paragraph from the CDC, there are essentially three primary points. The first is that the moratorium adds additional time for rent relief to reach renters. The second is that the moratorium further increases vaccination rates. And the third is that it can ensure effective public health measures. They list quarantine, isolation, and social distancing as some of these measures. Let's go through this point by point. Address the first point about rent relief and giving it more time, why do renters need relief right now? I I'm asking this sincerely. Do renters need relief right now? They're playing off of the premise that jobs are scarce, or at least that a steady flow of income is not available to many Americans. A substantial amount. If you're going to put a moratorium in place, you have to have a substantial amount of Americans who are in crisis. So let's look at the numbers together. According to an article by Ben Hopkin at NBC, written in April, there are actually more job listings available than pre-pandemic. Before the start of the pandemic, the shutdowns were at 10 million job openings. As the shutdowns began, those numbers tanked to 6 million. However, now the numbers have risen to 15 million. And mind you, this is from April, so presumably the numbers are even higher now. 5 million more than pre-pandemic. Despite the surge, we still have 5.4% unemployment rate in this country, nearly 2 percentage points higher than the 3.5% unemployment rate in the country pre-pandemic. So, why do we have so many unfilled jobs? The simple answer is we're not incentivizing work. In fact, we're de incentivizing work. The government has sent out stimulus checks, extended unemployment benefits, and allowed the moratorium to be put in place. Of course, I understand and I want to stipulate that these are not the only reasons for unemployment. There is a case to be made that there was a point in the pandemic where government aid was necessary because the unemployment was caused by the government. And I understand that there are hard situations where people truly do lose their jobs and have trouble finding employment. And I do have the utmost sympathy for these situations. I am not talking about the situations. I am simply saying that as a country, if we seek to grow economically and perform well in the global sphere, we have to stop de incentivizing work. We need to incentivize work, give people a reason to go back to work. This NBC article goes on to say factory owners and employers lament the generosity of unemployment benefits and stimulus payments have some workers avoiding returning to work because they make more money not working. I had one guy quit who said I can make more on unemployment. I'll take the summer off, said Robert Stevenson, CEO of Eastman Machine Company, a producer of machines that cut specialty fabrics for industry. I told him, I can't guarantee that you'll have a job when you get back. He said, I'll take my chances, unquote. This is the sort of attitude that is leading so many to unfilled jobs. This this is why we don't have filled jobs in the United States because we're incentivizing people to stay at home, receive the checks, and not have to pay their rent. So, based on all this data, based on these few numbers that I've thrown out, is a moratorium really necessary? Are mass numbers of Americans simply unable to get jobs? Do they need rent support? I would suggest not. It seems more that the unemployment in America is largely due to incentivizing unemployment. If we stop de-incentivizing unemployment, this problem may just go away. Okay, let's look at the second point that the CDC stipulates. So they say the second point is that the moratorium uh, is that it will provide additional time to further increase vaccination rates. I have a few problems with this argument. Firstly, for several months now, in all states, vaccines have been basically available to whoever wants them. If you're above the age of 12 in the United States, you can literally walk into your local Walgreens and get one for free. So, why do people need more time to get the vaccine? If you haven't gotten the vaccine at this point, it's probably not because you haven't had the chance. It's more likely that you've decided that you don't want it for one reason or another. Now, regardless of your reasoning behind not getting the vaccine, is giving you more time to not pay your rent going to change that? I have serious doubts. Secondly, what does a moratorium have to do with getting the vaccine anyway? The vaccines are free and they're available to nearly everyone nearly everywhere. Assuming for a second that everything that we've been told about the end of the moratorium, the mass evacuations, the uptick in homelessness, that's all true. Let's assume that for a second. Couldn't you theoretically still walk into your local Walgreens or any of the other many participating pharmacies for that matter and get your vaccine for free? I'd assume so. I'd assume that's all still true. All right. So the last and third point that the CDC gives for extending the moratorium in this little paragraph is that it will essentially ensure that people can utilize public health measures like quarantining, social distancing, and isolation. You know what? I'll give them this point. If you just give people apartments free of charge, then yes, they will have a place to quarantine. My only concern here is why we're limiting this moratorium to October. Why does it expire? Why not until next August? Why not for a few more years? Why ever? I'm sure there will be more variants, and where will renters go if they have to pay their rent? You know what? In fact, why don't we just suspend mortgage payments too? That way, we can ensure that homeowners can effectively quarantine too. Why are we discriminating against the homeowners? The reasoning that the CDC is giving here is so vague that there are very few limits to extending this moratorium. We have now set a precedent that any variant or minor uptick in cases can justify an extension or new moratorium. And we haven't even talked about the real victims here, which are the landlords. When people think of landlords, they're thinking of crazy rich people with money to spare, and they're not very sympathetic people in that light. But this is simply not the case. Sure, there are rich landlords just as there are rich people in virtually every field. But this moratorium is hurting the average everyday person that just happens to make their living as a landlord. And you know what? Even if every single landlord in the United States were rich, I would still hold this position because what is happening with this moratorium is theft. Plain and simple. When you rent a space, you agree to the terms and conditions. I pay you this much and follow the rules that you give me and you let me live here. It's that simple. When you fail to meet your portion of the agreement, the landlord has every right to retract his portion of the agreement. That's in the agreement itself. When you receive a good or service without paying the agreed upon price for said good or service, that's called theft. If you can't pay the price, you can't receive the service. That's where eviction comes in. It may seem harsh, but that's how it works. The moratorium is simply legalizing theft, and no matter if it's legal or not, it's immoral. All right. So the CDC goes on to say in this statement that they gave, the that quote, the emergence of Delta variant has led to a rapid acceleration of community transmission in the United States, putting more Americans at increased risk, especially if they're unvaccinated. The moratorium is the right thing to do to keep people in their homes and out of the congregate settings where COVID-19 spreads. It is imperative that public health authorities act quickly to mitigate such an increase of evictions, which could increase the likelihood of new spikes in SARS-CoV-2 transmissions. Such mass evictions and the attendant public health consequences would be very difficult to reverse. What the CDC says here is that the Delta variant is, quote, putting more Americans at increased risk, especially if they are unvaccinated, unquote. The question is increased risk of what? Getting COVID? Well, yes, the variant has been shown to be more transmissible. But does that really matter? Now, hear me out for a second. The infection rate really doesn't matter because if you don't get seriously ill or die, then no harm has really been done. Maybe it's a minor inconvenience or even a major inconvenience, but at the end of the day, you're fine. No one is scared about getting cold because you're extremely unlikely to die or get seriously ill from it. So, if the Delta variant isn't very deadly, then we wouldn't be at high risk, or even if it's extremely transmissible, it wouldn't really matter. So, with that said, will the Delta variant put you at more risk of becoming seriously ill or dying from COVID? That's unclear. To be totally honest with you, the studies are so far are mixed as to if the variant is more or less deadly than the original. But this is an important point to make nonetheless. The CDC is making claims about risk that are really unsubstantiated. So, to be clear, the CDC, an unelected body, is making economic and life changing decisions in opposition to the courts that are based on non existent data and unsound arguments. To me, that sounds a bit disturbing to say the least. So, a bit of good news to end the episode off with. A woman by the name of Tamira Mensah Stock. I'm sure that you've heard her name before if you listened to conservative media recently in any capacity. But she is a woman's wrestler, and she has competed in the Olympics and has recently become the second U.S. woman to ever win Olympic gold in the sport of wrestling. So after the competition, she gave an interview regarding the competition, and it was refreshingly patriotic and grateful and thankful towards the country. So I just want to play a clip of that.
Did you surprise yourself at all?
Of course I surprise myself. It's by the grace of God I'm able to even move my feet. Like, I just leave it in his hands, and I pray that all the practice, that the hell that my freaking coaches put me through pays off. And every single time it does, and I get better and better. And it's so weird that there is no cap to the limit that I can do. And I'm excited to see what I have next.
Last question for you. That American flag around your shoulders looks pretty good. How does that feel to represent your country like this?
It feels amazing. I love representing the U.S. I freaking love living there. I love it, and I'm so happy I get to represent USA. Love it.
Well said. Congratulations. Enjoy that gold, and we'll see you out there on the podium, okay?
Thank you. I'll try not to cry, but no promises.
I just find that clip so refreshing and inspiring, frankly, because in contrast to all of the uproar that we've seen, all of the people like LeBron James and Megan Rapinoe who just seem to have a complex of ungratefulness towards the country that is allowing them to play sports, a game, for their living. It's very saddening to me. And let's be frank about this. These athletes are extremely skilled people. They've put in a ton of work, but at the end of the day, these sports are games. We don't need sports stars. we don't need them, but they we live in such a privileged country that we are able to pay them a full salary, more than what the average person would get from a salary, maybe in their entire lifetimes in the cases of people like LeBron James, to play a sport for entertainment. And to see a woman who is not only accepting that this is the case, that she is in a great position to be representing her country, but she's thankful and grateful to do so. She's happy to be there, and then she attributes it to God. This is not about herself. She is not the one that is making all of this possible. It is God. And I'm sure that if you asked Megan Rapinoe about her skill set, it would be all attributed to her own set of skills, what she has put in the work. And this woman is so refreshing. She talks about in her previous interviews and before this clip that I've just included, she talks about the work that she's put in and the confidence that she has, but she attributes it to God. At the end of the day, it is God's doing. And I find that so refreshing. A woman who loves her country and a woman who is not self-centered and incredibly grateful. So I just want to end on that high note. Thank you all for listening. This has been Newsworthy.